I'd like to call this meeting of Bellingham City Council Public Works Public Safety Committee to order. Joining me on the committee is Michael Lilliquist and Jack Weiss. We have 4 items before us today, so let's dive right in. The first is a patrol staffing and deployment study. And Chief Cook, you leading this?
Yes, sir. All right. Thank you, Terry. Council, Cliff Cook, Chief of Police for the City of Bellingham. If you'll recall, late last year, early fall, I made you aware during the budget process that we were looking at a study based on data from the department to come up with a staffing and deployment plan for the department that moves away from the traditional officers per thousand formula or relying on anecdotal information or benchmarking compared to other cities. And over the last several months, Mr. Friesmeier has conducted that study, and he has completed the study and presented a final report to the department. And I would like to have him provide you with some information around that report, a general summary, and then recommendations to the department. One thing I would like to emphasize is this study focused solely on our patrol function. It did not focus on or touch on the investigative divisions in our department or other functions of the department. This is strictly a patrol deployment and staffing study. Secondly, Mr. Friesmeier is going to be here throughout the day between 10 and noon and between 2 and 4. I realize you have a very busy schedule, but if you have some time and would like to ask further questions of him, he will be at the police department on the second floor staff room, and he has this presentation and all of his data and information that if you have deeper questions that go beyond the scope of this presentation, he'll be more than happy to answer them for you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Friesmeier.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Time this morning. I'm going to use PowerPoint to try to get through this. We have a 10-month study to try to present in 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to choose the best line I can, and if I'm too deep, please tell me, and if I'm not deep enough, please tell me, okay?
Okay.
The goal of this study, as the Chief said, is to look at the patrol division, and not just to look at how many people they need, but to look at how they can improve efficiency overall by getting the right number of people, getting them deployed properly, getting them scheduled properly, and then getting the right accountability processes in place so they know where their people are, what they're doing, when the work's taking place. So I'm going to talk about 4 general areas this morning. Resource analysis, having the right people, proper beat design, optimal deployment, which has to do with scheduling, and data collection methods. We'll begin with appropriate staffing. This is known as resource allocation, making sure you have the appropriate amount of people in order to reach a certain performance level. Now, the study was based on actually 5 years of computer-aided dispatch data within the police department, 2009 through 2013. We also took 3 years of officer leave data, which include records on vacation time, sick leave, bereavement leave, 3 months of training record, or 3 years of training records, a 4-month sample of report writing times, because oftentimes when officers write the reports, they don't do it in conjunction with the call itself because there's other calls holding in busy times. So they'll write the report at a later time. Most of that does not get captured in the CAD because the officers are trying to remain available for other calls for service. So we had to take a sample of that. We looked at the current patrol division schedules. We looked at the shape files for how the beats are set up within the city right now. And then numerous on-site visits, roll call attendance, and meetings with command staff. Now we're looking at reactive workload. What is the number of hours that officers have to spend responding to calls for service and doing those other things that are an expectation from the city upon them? And when we look at 2009 through 2013 actual data, we see it started to drop in 2009 through 2011, and in 2012 and 2013, things started to pick up again. Now, we took each one of those calls individually, so we looked at every type of offense, from assault to burglary to warrant arrest, and we forecasted each one of those activities into the next 3 years, assuming that things remain the same within the city of Bellingham. And so we see that in 14, 15, and 16, we see that workload anticipated to rise a little bit each year. Now, in subsequent years, the agency can take their actual data, plug into the spreadsheet, and see what's actually taking place with that forecast. This includes all time spent by the officers from dispatch to clear on all calls. It includes secondary officers, not just the primary officer, it also has an estimated report writing time element in there. So out of that 4-month sample, we tried to estimate how much time they spend writing reports and include that in. Now, it does not include proactive activity. Proactive activity, things like bar checks and area checks, things that the officers do of a community policing nature. That's not included in these totals. When we look at minimum staffing, we go off that reactive workload we just looked at, and we look at how much time they have to devote to answering calls for service. And so we see in 2014 today, if the officers are going to do nothing more than go out and respond to reactive calls for service with no proactive time whatsoever, you'd have to field roughly 12 officers every 24-hour period. Now, running call to call is not efficient for your officers. It's not good performance for your community. And so most agencies will try to get to an even split. Out of every patrol hour, they'll try to get 30 minutes for reactive time and 30 minutes for proactive time. And my time spent with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, when we would do studies, we tried to get to that even split of 30-30 for the officers. Same thing with Northwestern University when I worked with them. So if we were to assume an even 30-30 split in the city of Bellingham, not only would you have to deploy 12 officers at a minimum, you'd have to put another 12 out there for the proactive time. So a total in 2014 of roughly 23.62 or 24 officers per day that need to be fielded. Now, there's something referred to as a shift relief factor. And in order to put one person on the street every day of the year, you have to have a certain number of people on the department. For your agency, that comes out to be 2.25 officers. So for every one car you want to staff on day shift, you need 2.25 people on your patrol force in order to do that. Now, that shift relief factor is based on regularly scheduled days off. It's based on the amount of leave time taken. It's based on the amount of non-patrol time, like training and special assignments. And it's based on net compensatory time usage. How officers use comp time. Do they take it in pay, which is a budgetary issue, or do they take it in leave, which is a resource allocation issue? So when we look at those 4 issues, this is the amount, or the average amount of time off taken per year by the average patrol officer. When you come down to compensatory time earned, they work 113 hours over and above what we expect them to work, but only take 15.85 hours of comp time off. So the average officer is actually putting more work into patrol than what you would anticipate. You'll see the numbers. They kind of speak for themselves, hopefully, but you'll see the shift relief factor comes out to be 2.25. Now, if we need to field 23.62 units per day in 2014 to keep that even split of 30 minutes of proactive and 30 minutes of reactive each hour, with a shift relief factor of 2.25 officers for every one position you need to fill, we multiply those 2 numbers together and we come up with 53.06. So based on 5 years of CAD data and 4 years of leave time, or 3 years of leave time, your officers at the present time are running 33.27 minutes out of the hour on reactive time, slightly above where most agencies would like to be. In order to get where you need, well, a 30-30 split. I can't say need. That's a decision you have to make. In order to get to a 30-30 split, you would need a staff size of 53.06. At the present time, you're at 48 and at 33.27 minutes. Now, what is the right minutes of reactive time for your agency? I can't answer that for you, gentlemen. That's a decision that you have to make along with the chief as to what level of performance you want out of your police department, what the citizens expect, and what they're willing to pay for. Okay. Moving to the second area, proper beat design. Beat analysis is the distribution or the breakdown of the city so that we can deploy officers and try to keep an even coverage across the city. This results in lower response times. It results in more officer familiarization with their area. At the present time, your city is broken down into 6 patrol beats. Call 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8. Over to the right, you'll see a chart that shows the amount of reactive workload occurring in each of those beats. What I did, your city is broken into 65 patrol blocks, smaller divisions that make up your beats. So we calculated the amount of reactive time that occurred over the last 5 years in each one of those patrol blocks, and then summed them up for the beats. So you'll see that beat 1 was carrying 23% of the workload, while beat 8 was carrying 12% of the workload. The goal here is to even that up so that we can make each beat with about an equitable workload. Now, there's a lot of different ways we can break those beats up. We could do it based on miles. If we were to do that, call 8 would get the most people because it has 26% of the mileage. However, it only carries 12% of the workload. So the most equitable way to do this is based on reactive time. So we used that same data that was analyzed through the 5 years of CAD data and looked at the reactive time in each area. Now this is your current patrol blocks. There are 65 patrol blocks that cover the entire city. They butt up against each other, they don't overlap, and we can use those as building blocks to build the beats. The way we went about this is we calculated the workload in each area, and then we chose the highest 6 workload areas and used those as anchors and started building blocks around those anchors to reconstruct the nature of the beats. Now there's some constraints we had to use while we were doing that. We had to make sure that we didn't take the interstate and put a beat on both sides of the interstate where you couldn't get from one side to the other, or your natural trails or creeks or anything of that nature. Now, in order to come up with the final version, I took the workload for each of those patrol blocks and I provided that to the agency in an interactive spreadsheet. And I gave them a shapefile that showed them where each block was located. Lieutenant Bill Sladisco put together an internal committee made up of both the blue team and the gold team from the police department. And they sat down and put those blocks together based on their collective time spent patrolling the streets. I haven't patrolled your streets. I don't know that you can't get from point A to point B. But these officers did, and they did a nice job. They constructed 6 new beats. They are very similar to the old with some major differences. Paul 1 now doesn't come south of I-5 anymore. It drifts over to the east. Paul 2 is contained completely underneath I-5. They were able to drop the differences in the workload from a difference of 23 and 12% down to a high of 18 and a low of 16. So a good reduction in that inequality among the beats. If you look, this is the current at 23% and 12%. This is the proposed at 16 and 18%. So should notice a difference in response times and in the amount of workload among those various beats. Now, your current patrol blocks, I would recommend are in current need of being updated. With only 67 patrol blocks, they're not granular enough to be able to create very good shaped beats. So one of the recommendations that I would like to make is that they reconstruct the underlying shapefile, and instead of having only 65 beats, they move that to around 350 to 400 patrol blocks. When it comes time for crime analysis and they go under a new CAD, having much smaller patrol blocks will be able to allow them to do crime analysis to a much more detailed level and be able to pinpoint exactly where activities are taking place. It would also be helpful for beat design the next time they go through this exercise. So shapefile has been provided. This is the current patrol block. This is the proposed patrol block. So you see it greatly reduces the size of those areas and allows more detailed decision making. The third section of this is optimal deployment, making sure that we've got the schedules configured to the workload curve as best we can. Now, there's a lot of things you have to look at when you look at schedules. There's a lot of things you have to weigh. Things like unity of command, where every officer reports to the same supervisor. Team integrity, where everybody works with the same group when they come into work. Schedule equity, meaning everybody gets the opportunity for a weekend time off periodically. You have to look at training compatibility. How does the schedule work with the ability to train officers and to train them as a team? Schedule efficiency. How well does it work with your workload curve? Is the schedule creating a lot of overtime, or does it reduce overtime for the agency? And also the risk of fatigue. Some schedules are more fatiguing on officers, particularly your night shift. There's a number of different types of schedules. We're limited on time, so I can't go into great detail on this, but unstructured schedules are used by a very small percentage of the agency. Their benefit does not really outweigh the cost that you give up for Bellingham. Fixed days off schedules would be your typical 8-hour 5 on 2 off, or your 10-hour 4 on 3 off. And there's some advantages and some disadvantages to that one as well. Locked rotating schedules, which is the type of schedule Bellingham is using right now. This allows officers, when there's a long off-duty period somewhere in the schedule, like a 5-day off period, it always falls on the same days of the week. So that 5 days off is always going to be on the weekend. Unlocked rotating schedules don't give you that ability. They float across the 7 days of the week. Now, the first thing we have to do when we're looking at schedules and trying to be efficient is to determine when your workload is coming in, both by day of the week and hour of the day. When we look at the pie chart, we see that the workload is fairly equitable across the 7 days of the week. Sunday is low at 12.57, Friday's high at 15.89, only a difference of about 3.3%, not a big deal. The bottom chart shows when the work is coming in across the 24 hours of the day for the 7 days of the week. And we see that this troughs at about the same time every day at 6 o'clock. And it peaks at about the same time, 3 o'clock every afternoon. Since that schedule has a consistent curve across the 7 days of the week, the agency is able to use a locked rotating schedule that gives you uniform staffing by day of the week and still be efficient with the schedule. Now, one of the ways we measure efficiency is we look at the difference between the workload curve, that's the proportion of work coming in at a particular time of the day, and the staffing curve, the proportion of officers that are on duty at that given time. Now, to be completely efficient, you want those two lines to sit right on top of each other. So if 15% of the workload is coming in, you have 15% of your available staff on the street to handle that. Any differences that you see are inefficiencies. And it doesn't matter if you're proportionally overstaffed or proportionally understaffed. To give up one, you have to give up one to gain the other. And so either one is an inefficiency. At the current time, the Bellingham Police Patrol schedule is about 72.53% efficient. That's not terrible. The lighter curve, the yellow curve, shows the percentage of available staff working at any given day of the week on average. The black line shows the workload curve. So we see proportionally we're a little bit over on the midnight shift hours, but that's necessary because you have to have enough people out there for the officers to act safely. You're getting very few calls coming in. So you can't drop down to only 2 officers and still have them safe on the street. We fall a little bit behind in the late morning, early afternoon. Now, a couple of things we can do to fix that. First, we can try redistributing existing staff. So in this recommendation, we take 2 people off the night shift, we move them up onto the swing shifts. We're able to increase efficiency by 3.24%. You'll notice that this curve drops a little bit in deep nights and it comes back up in the afternoon, so we can try to match that curve a little bit better. So efficiency goes up to 75.77. Second alternative is to alter the start times. So if we take the entire schedule and we move it back 1 hour on the start times, we can increase efficiency by 5.36%. So we go up to 77.89. Neither of those alternatives require the addition of any additional officers. It's just being more efficient with the current resources that they have. The one concern I have with the current schedule is that for night shift officers working 10 hours and 40 minutes, working 5 consecutive days in a row, is an increased fatigue risk. And so I'd like to make the recommendation in the report that they consider looking at another alternative on the night shift. The bottom shift is still a 10-hour and 40-minute shift. It still gives them the built-in training that they have. It still gives them a 4-week rotation. But the most an officer ever works is 3 days in a row before taking a day off. Now, again, we have to weigh that with the other benefits of the schedule. And so I throw it out as a proposal, and it's totally up to the agency whether they wish to act on that or not. Just as a record or a reference, I also modeled an 8-hour fixed day off schedule, a 10-hour fixed day off schedule, and a 12-hour schedule. The efficiency for the 8-hour was 76.37. The efficiency for the 10-hour was 75.26. The efficiency for the 12-hour was 77.60. The moral of the story, gentlemen, the current schedule on the 1040 builds in 1 training day for every officer every month, which is a huge benefit for the agency. We can still get good efficiency out of it by moving the shifts to be consistent with your workload curve and by putting the right amount of people on the right shifts. So I'm not going to recommend that they change the shift that they're on. The shift is giving good efficiency. We just have to look at that fatigue factor on the midnight shift and see if we can put something else in place to reduce the number of consecutive days worked. The last section is accurate data collection. If you want to be efficient, you've got to be able to collect good data on what your staff is doing, where they're at, so you can use that data to try to make improvements. At the present time, the CAD system that the police department is using is antiquated. It's over 21 years old. It does not have the capability to capture the sort of things that they need to capture. The only thing that can be captured in their CAD right now are incident-related activities. So when officers are out doing proactive enforcement, doing community activity types of activities, the CAD's not capturing that time. It's happening underneath the radar. Report writing times cannot accurately be captured, and there's a lot of time spent writing reports. A lot of administrative time that the officers are using, which has to be done for them to function properly, is not being captured in the CAD. We also found, if you take time to read through the report, there were a lot of errors that we found in the CAD data, where the CAD was making ghost records using an apartment number as an officer number and throwing records in, which was concerning. It's an old system, and it may have been good 20 years ago, but there's a lot of other products out there that offer the capabilities that the chief needs to be able to track this data. And so a big recommendation is that you transfer to a new CAD system as soon as possible. Also, a centralized HR package in use by a lot of police departments across the country. And it's a way that they use to track their leave times for their officers, to track special assignments, to track training. Oftentimes in the police department, they'll need to pull somebody from patrol and move them into somewhere else to help out temporarily. And as you're moving those people around, you need to be able to track that to know where your people are. And so packages like Telestaff, Speed Shift, In-Time Watch Commander are available, and I think they would help the record keeping within the police department considerably. Finally, current documentation practices need to be improved, and this is just a matter of training with the officers. Oftentimes, officers see the CAD as a way of calling in so that dispatchers know where they are. They don't see it as a record-keeping tool. And so it's just going to be a matter of retraining and educating and it's consistently staying on the officers to get them in the habit of constantly calling out what they're doing. At the same time, improving the methodologies within the police department to be able to capture that data. So 4 pieces that have to be there in order to be truly efficient with your resources. You have to have the right people, or the right amount of people. You have to have them deployed optimally. You have to have them scheduled to match your workload curve. And you have to be able to capture that workload data that's taking place so you can use that for better decisions. What kind of questions could I answer for you?
Questions? Michael?
It seemed that was really impressive, and I'm glad to see the department is, I don't know, taking a very enlightened approach to all this. But none of what you talked about referred to actual crime rates and effectiveness. How does that come into the picture? For example, what we really want is, rather than capturing criminals after the fact, preventing it. We really want low crime rates is our goal. How does all of this, and how can the effectiveness guide which of the choices are best?
Well, there are a lot of performance measures that go along with having the right people where they're at.
Speak into the microphone because this is being
Yes.
recorded.
There's a lot of performance measures that tie into these 4 things that we've talked about. Having the right amount of people, having them scheduled right, having the beat design set up. Some of those, and you'll see in the report, are things like probability of saturation. When the next call comes in, what's the probability that an officer will be available to handle that call? When we look at cross-beat dispatching, when your minutes of reactive time get too high, officers are spending more and more time outside of their beat. And so they're not as prone to do the follow-ups inside their beat. They don't know what's going on inside their beat. And that leads to a lot of the things you're asking about crime rates and different types of crime. In the study, and you've just seen kind of the surface, but there's many underlying spreadsheets that break down every particular activity. So looking at assaults and burglaries and batteries, when are they taking place? How long is it taking to handle those particular types of offenses? And so what we're trying to get here is to be as granular with our data collection as possible so we can see where they're taking place. Breaking down the beat design into 384 patrol blocks instead of 65 is going to allow us to be able to pinpoint exactly where those crimes are taking place so that the agency can start to target those particular areas. Right now, with the CAD system that they're working with, the data they're collecting is almost too general to be as specific as they need to do some in-depth crime fighting that you're talking about and knowing where those calls are coming from.
What about the 30-30 minute split? It seems to me that if you want to prevent crimes, maybe the 30 of proactive is more important, whereas the 30 of reactive is obviously, I mean, it also addresses crime, but differently.
Well, the 30 reactive comes from your calls for service.
Right.
That is totally driven by how much work the citizens are calling to have done.
I would love it if we had no calls and it was all proactive. That's not the real world. But I'm asking about the 30-30 split with regard to reducing crime rates. Is that how 30-30 was chosen? Does someone believe that that's somehow optimal for prevention as well as enforcement?
That is a judgment call in most agencies. I have the opportunity to work with agencies across the country. I spent 4 years out in the city of Flint, Michigan. They're running 58 minutes out of the hour, and so leaving 2 minutes out of the hour for proactive enforcement. Community policing is not being done in that community because there is not enough time to do it. Other agencies I've worked with have been down to 27 minutes out of the hour for reactive activity because they place a high priority on safety and community policing activities. So really the right amount of proactive and reactive time is a matter, it's not a matter of mathematics or statistics, it's a matter of human judgment and community resources. What do your citizens want and what are they willing to pay for? Where did the 30-30 split come from? You won't find it written anywhere, I'm afraid. That's a common practice that's been used by researchers, and I've used it for 10 years when it's possible. But in some agencies, it's just not possible.
Well, that's where you started. You said that 30-30 split is a judgment call that we as policymakers in the city have to make, and so that's why I was looking for guidance on that.
Yeah.
Why is that a good number? What experience led people to pick that ratio?
That's a good question. I think a lot
And
of
can
it,
we afford that ratio? Because clearly
Yeah.
we could run cheap and, change the ratio.
Sure. That's the ratio that's been used by many large organizations like Northwestern, like the IECP, has been the 30-30 split. When you allow your minutes of reactive time to go up, when they start getting beyond that 30 minutes, your patrol intervals, the time spent between consecutive rounds by the same location. So if somebody were to come into your town and they wanted to purchase drugs, and so they sat across the street from a house to see how long it was before the officer came by on their next round, that's a patrol interval. Well, that patrol interval increases in length exponentially as your minutes of reactive time goes up. The probabilities of saturation, when the call comes in, the probability the next call is going to be stacked, that probability goes up exponentially with your minutes of reactive time. Your crossbeat dispatching, the need to send an officer out of their assigned area into somebody else's area to take calls for service, goes up exponentially with your minutes of reactive time. And so it's not a straight line curve, it's an exponentially decaying curve. And you have to ask yourself, where is the return on investment here? And for many agencies,
That's what I'm asking.
It turns
Yeah.
out to be right around that 30-30 split.
Thank you.
Jack, any questions?
Yeah, when I was looking at the very first graph that you had in terms of the number of responses, the annual responses.
Yes, sir.
That the department's dealing with. Yeah, that one there. That kind of surprised me because to me it seemed like the numbers would be higher during our recession years, given what was going on, and I'm really quite surprised that there'd be like a 10% jump between 2012 and 2013. What happened from your?
Excuse me. I believe that is a belief many people have, and some people in the law enforcement profession had, is that when times are economically hard, crime will rise. And in my experience, it's the opposite. As things improve, crime tends to rise. And I think that's a matter of, is there a larger number of victims out there? And without getting into too much detail, because we don't have the time, if you look at our current crime rate, our violent crimes are low. Attacks on individuals, although they do occur, are low in comparison to other cities our size. What's driving our crime rate is property crimes, thefts, burglaries, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And frankly, to kind of answer Mr. Lilliquist's question as well as yours, we don't do a very good job in that arena because we don't have the resources to do the follow-up. A lot of the follow-up on property crimes is actually being done by patrol officers because the detectives are focused on violent criminal investigations. So there's a staffing issue with investigations that we'll have to deal with later. As far as patrol is concerned, there are many times in a given work week, throughout that work week, where an officer may be covering 2 or 3 beats because we don't have the staff in the field to put an officer on every single beat. And in some cases, in a high crime beat, like we currently have in the north area, because one officer is trying to cover a huge geographic area with a lot of activity, and that's the reason for the beat change, you might put 2 officers there. So we're faced with the issue of the inability to cover all the beats, so officers having to take on additional work, meaning they're moving from call to call or their proactive time is minimized. We try to consider ourselves a community-oriented policing agency, and it isn't just what some people might equate that with, going to functions, making meetings. Community-oriented policing is having an officer on a beat frequently enough, regularly enough, to know that beat, know the people who live on it, know when something's awry, understand where their hot spots are for crime. That gets to the granular issue on our crime analysis. If you do a hotspot map on our crime analysis based on crimes in our city right now, you'll get this huge hotspot. We'll actually cover an entire beat because the system doesn't allow us to narrow it down. So we try to do it with officer knowledge and experience. But if they're not on that beat regularly, then they don't get that opportunity. So the prevention part has a lot to do with, are we visible? Are we visible on a frequent basis? And does that officer have time to focus on crime issues in that specific beat, as well as quality of life issues that may contribute to some of the problems in that beat? I think Mr. Weiss made note some weeks ago about the rising number of shopping carts in your neighborhood. And visually, that's an indicator that there's a problem. It isn't just because people are walking off with that shopping cart, but it's an indication there's another underlying issue in that neighborhood. So the whole point is the greater amount of proactive time, the larger amount of time each individual officer has to focus on problems that contribute to crime in that particular beat, which is usually several neighborhoods.
There's a
We're not
compounding
there.
factor with that also, that the more proactive time there is, the more time that officer can stay inside their beat, which maintains the beat integrity, which improves their ability to do what needs to be done inside that beat.
One other question I had to do with the patrol area proposal of changing the boundaries.
Yes.
Are you anticipating, I think we're going to have probably about 3 annexation proposals within the next couple of years, but are you anticipating that extra workload of annexation area into, it looks like Patrol Area 1?
We will have that ability through the product that Mr. Friesmeier has provided to us. We can take the crime stats from that proposed annex area and plug them in. That'll give us a better idea of what our staffing should be, but I would use some caution there. My experience in other cities has been when an annexation occurs, you're dependent upon the data collection by the sheriff's office. And quite frankly, policing provided by a sheriff's agency and that provided by a municipal or urban agency are different. There are different expectations. Response times may be longer because, quite frankly, sheriff's departments cover a larger area with fewer people. So it could give us some information, but it's not accurate. We would need a year or 2 in that area. There are proposed annexation areas in this city. Without naming them specifically, there are some that provide very little concern if we were to annex, as far as I'm concerned. There's 1 or 2 that I have some serious reservations about because we are aware they are higher crime neighborhoods with other problems, underlying social economic issues that create that environment. And for us to take on even a small area with a high crime rate is going to put some stress upon our staffing. So we have to be cautious about how we go forward on certain annexations.
I'm working at the current time with Fort Collins, Colorado, and Santa Rosa, California, both of which are looking at large annexations, and we're trying to build in how do we do that. And I'll support exactly what the chief said. There's no way of knowing how they're going to police it versus how it's currently being policed by the sheriff's office. The chances are that there's going to be much more workload than what the sheriff's doing at the present time. And so you just need the ability to modify your calculations quickly so you can be fluid in those changes as that annexation comes on. So.
To change the night schedule from 5 days on to 3 days on, that also means it changes the days off. So you don't have the 5 days in a row off. So I'm assuming that might be, is that a negotiated, to change it, that has to be negotiated? Okay. That's what I was afraid of.
And Mr. Friesmeier and I have spoken quite a bit about it, and members of my staff and I have spoken about that issue. His experience, Mr. Friesmeier's experience, has been that when officers are asked to do that, they balk because they're comfortable, and like most people, they don't like a lot of change.
They want the 5 days off.
Right, they see that as a huge benefit. But when there have been agencies that have moved to that proposed schedule that he suggested in this report, after several months, the officers come to realize that it's probably from a perspective of health, it's more desirable. And that's primarily what drives his recommendation is the fatigue factor. Younger officers on the graveyard shift don't sometimes have the difficulty with recovery that I might have if I were on that shift now.
I understand.
So that's a serious consideration. I think this is an issue we have to have some discussions with the police guild. I think we want to look at what's better for not only the department but healthier for our officers. So that's a discussion we will have. I can't promise you that they would be willing to make that change. Obviously, it has to be discussed and negotiated.
Yeah, because I'm assuming fatigue factor also plays into efficiency. As
Yes, it
you're
does.
more fatigued.
And officer safety
you
and citizen
think-
safety.
Yeah,
Right, right.
Yeah.
If I could, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Sir, go ahead.
Okay, how about a quick one? We're starting to run over. And
I know, sorry about that.
So we can ask later, but.
Well, this has
one
to
last
do
one.
with something actually larger. It has to do with, I think in 2009 or a while back, we did a public safety task force report, which looked at, I think it was both police and fire. But with regard to patrol, it made several recommendations. It had several conclusions. One of those conclusions that stuck out in my mind was that adding officers onesies, twosies isn't always useful, but adding a whole patrol or, moving so you can make kind of a reorganizational change, not just adding one officer, but allowing a organizational change. How did I assume you read the old task force report. How did the old task force report recommendations play into these new patrol recommendations?
Well, frankly, I read the report, although I would like to see the recommendation be replicated through this process. I think to some extent it will be. The recommendation out of that report was to add 25 officers to the department. Any chief will tell you, anytime you're adding that number to an agency of our size, that's a huge plus. But frankly, to Mr. Friesmeier's point, we want to look at it from what is efficient, what is the focus the community wants from our department. Do they want a community policing agency that is focused on prevention and relationships in the neighborhoods and throughout the community, which I say you could look at what's happened across the country and those agencies that are having serious problems. In the background, you will recognize that it's relationships that they lack. They haven't had that focus on the community. I think besides the community policing commitment, it's again an issue of what will the community be willing to pay for, what can the community afford. So I agree with you, onesies and twosies is not the way to do it. It's currently the way we are doing it because our budget limits that. The most glaring example I can give you is the mayor's wanted a commitment downtown beyond what we currently provide. We have bike officers downtown and an officer assigned to that beat. And she would like to see a commitment of 2 officers to downtown and that are not pulled out periodically to answer other calls. And I'd like to provide that. But if we hire those 2 officers today and they are not laterals, meaning they are not coming from another agency, they're new, the hiring and training process is over 6 months, 9 months generally. Their field training period is 3.5 months if they have no difficulties, and then they get deployed. So we're looking at anywhere from a year to a year and a half before those officers are in solo status to be deployed. So there is a need to look ahead, not only based on what we anticipate the workload will be over the next few years, what we see the trends being, how are we going to meet those demands in a way where we're prepared to do it at the time the demand starts. Because if the demand occurs and we don't have the resources, we will fall back into what we're currently doing. We will be playing catch-up all the time.
Well, thank you. By the way, I share the mayor's interest in doing more on downtown.
I want to thank you, Chief, for getting this report. I think this is really well done. Seeing a really data-driven, detailed report and recommendations, I really appreciate that. It's so much easier to look at and go off from than the anecdotal, and I think this is really well done. So thank you, and I
Thank you,
definitely
Chair.
recommend our other council members, they're not watching now, to watch this report, and we will have copies for them, correct?
I have them right here. The formal report will be provided to the mayor's office, and I'm sure that she'll want to share that with you once she has a chance to review it herself. This is not a new model. This is a model that started in the late 80s, became prevalent in the early 90s. Frankly, I was surprised that Bellingham PD was not doing it this way, because the agency has got a reputation of being progressive. I just don't know that maybe others were aware of it or were aware of it and couldn't afford to pay for the consulting, because frankly it's not cheap, but I'll tell you Mr. Friesmeier has saved us money in this process, not only with what he's recommending, but dealing with one of our vendors with the CAD issues and data collection. They were wanting to charge us a substantial sum of money to get into some of the data we needed, and he pointed out a route whereby they could do that, and it cost us nothing. So it's great to have a consultant not only here to give you what you need, but also help you find other solutions to save funds that are pretty tight for these sorts of purposes.
I just wanted to say, while we've spent 10 months trying to find as much cumulative workload as we can, please expect, this is like teaching a third world country to farm. They've not manipulated the soil, they've not added. So as we start improving data collections, the chances are the reactive workload is going to increase over the next few years as officers begin to take credit for things that they've been doing for a long time under the radar and not documenting in the CAD. So I just wanted to make sure that was out on the table. That,
Well, I do thank you for the report today, and yeah, look forward to see where we go with these results. Yes. Next up on the schedule is High Street closure through Western Washington University's campus.
Good morning, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. I think the council is aware of the partial closure on High Street through the university's campus. Currently, that section of High Street is closed during the day, opened in the evening and on weekends. Several months ago, the university approached the Public Works Department, and given the changes in how the university is operating now, the changes that we see on High Street in terms of activity, much different than in the mid-'70s when this agreement was first put in place and the ordinance was first created. Those discussions with the university suggest that it may make sense, and we believe it does make sense, to implement a full closure of that section of High Street. There's much more pedestrian activity now than there used to be. The university is a year-round operation, continues to have high activity on the weekends, summer, and in the evening. And really, from a safety perspective, was the way this was looked at. It makes some sense in both the Public Works Department's mind and the university's to implement a full closure. Obviously, emergency vehicles and public transit would continue to have access the way they do now, so this would not impact the public transit service. It would not impact the ability of police, fire to respond through this section of High Street. And another important provision is currently we do have the ability to open up High Street to general purpose traffic during inclement weather. So the grade on High Street is slightly less than if you go around the campus. So if we have significant snow and ice situations, we can open it. We would retain that ability to do so under this proposed new ordinance. So we would still have the opportunity to open it up at the Public Works Department's discretion. There's one change that I would like to point out. We talked about this. The ordinance that's before council actually refers to the change to creating a permanent closure, and that's in the actual ordinance document on page 8 of your packet. And we talk about a permanent closure or permanently closed to vehicular traffic. We'd actually like to not add that language because it's not a permanent closure. It will be a full-time closure, but the city reserves the right to go in and open High Street up again. So it's a minor change, but we think an important one. It won't change what's happening. It will be closed full-time to general purpose traffic, but rather than having it called a permanent closure, we'll just have the rest of the language as is.
Just to delete the word permanent?
Just delete the word permanent.
It shall be closed.
So it'll be closed, and we've had lots of discussion with the university about this. Really what we're trying to do is just limit general purpose traffic through there all the time. But we know that things may change, and we hate to say permanent closure, which would then require us coming back to council if we needed to open it up for one reason or the other. Vice President Swan is here today from the university if there's any questions, but he's done a really nice job, in my opinion, of reaching out to the neighborhoods. He's been to the adjoining neighborhoods to talk about this, and has received support from the neighborhoods for making this change. We've also talked about it with neighborhoods and have received that same support. So what's before the council today would be a new ordinance, and with that minor change of removing the word permanently, we would recommend that council approve this ordinance.
Jack.
Yeah, I think this is something that's a long time in coming, and I would move approval of the modified ordinance,
Okay.
or amended ordinance.
Yeah, this being right in my backyard, I've seen the changes over the years in terms of the amount of people on campus throughout the years and the crossings and things, and I think it's probably a good thing. The one question I have, and I think I do know the answer, but it might come up for people needing to be dropped off for events. How will that affect? Because I know for some people that have limited mobility and things,
Right, I
being
think
able to be dropped off by the
Yeah, that's a good question, and I know that's something that the university has considered. That may be one of the challenges, and I don't know if Mr. Swan would like to come down and, from the city's perspective, that would really be something that maybe the university could manage on a case-by-case basis. But
I know that's probably the one question I'll get from some of the neighbors in the neighborhood associations and things.
Sure, Steve Swan from Western Washington University. It is a good question, and one that we have talked about. Fact of the matter is that we deal with that with daytime events as well.
Right.
And so the location of the restriction, where the restriction starts, isn't going to change. It's going to stay in that same spot. Okay. The parking lot that's adjacent to PAC, where people are used to dropping off, will still have that complete accessibility.
Okay. Good. Good. I assumed that, but I know people watch this, and I want to make sure that they were aware that it wouldn't affect that.
Yes.
Okay. So, Michael.
I don't have a problem with his proposal, but in the same area, Highland Drive comes down, and that's the one that cuts off. It's a strange, wide open kind of street that I've had complaints from people in the area, invites people going right at or over the speed limit. And I know this doesn't directly relate to that, but given the fact that this will now become a full-time closure and that will always be the route the traffic goes, last time I approached Public Works, you basically said, we don't really have the accident data to prove there's a problem there. But to me, it feels like there's almost a problem there, if not a real problem there. There will be a problem there, perhaps. What is your feeling on that? How Highland will now continue, and the pedestrian safety issues, basically, because it's a wide open road and cars travel quickly.
We can certainly look at that. I know we did some traffic volume counts to see what the volumes were on High Street, how many people were actually using it during the period that it was open. And Eric, I don't know if you recall, but it was very, very minor. There's very few people. Most people go around anyway, even when it's open in the evening and on weekends. So I think in our mind, it will be a minor impact on Highland Drive, but certainly something we can look at. Do you have any other comments on that?
So what I guess I'm saying is that it probably will be a very, very minor impact, but so it's kind of a separate issue. It seems to me that there's something maybe engineering-wise that could be done about that intersection, and given the fact that we're now going to have a full-time closure, we might have much more flexibility to change how the roadway goes off of campus, how we change the roadway.
Yeah, it's certainly something we can look at. Yep.
Okay, so we have a motion before us. All those in favor of recommending to the full council approval tonight? Answer aye.
Aye.
All right, unanimous. Moving right along, a request for council to authorize night paving for 2014 overlay.
Yes, thank you. We are in the process of our annual overlay program, and the code does require that if we want to work in the evening other than emergency work, that we come to council to get, in essence, a noise variance to allow us to do that. We're requesting that in the areas near the schools, Fairhaven Middle School in particular. The areas are highlighted on your agenda, Bill. We'll be paving on 14th Street, Electric, and Hawthorne. Those are the general areas. And to avoid disruption of the school during the daytime, we would ask that council authorize nighttime paving. We would limit the nighttime paving in any one of those locations to 2 nights. I think that we could get out of there within that time frame, and would generally help traffic flow much better in those areas. So with that, that is our request for a noise variance.
Committee?
Move approval.
Okay, Michael?
The agenda bill says that various outreach activities are planned to inform the public. What sort of work has been done to date? Because if I lived on 14th or anywhere near there, I might have a reaction. Have the neighbors seen this coming yet?
Freeman Anthony, Public Works. We've gone through our, what we call typical outreach, which was sending out the construction postcard and then reaching out specifically to the schools. We've generated an email list from interested people there. So I would say the typical standard outreach, wasn't a project of any size where we did substantial open houses or anything on the front end there.
There was a press release that went out as well that the Herald did pick up. So there was an article in the Herald that suggested there may be evening paving in these areas. Freeman mentioned to me that we haven't made the final decision yet to pave at night, so this is providing us some flexibility. We believe we're going to need it, but we need to have the authorization to do so if it does turn out that it has to be done.
Yes, Michael.
When you say evening paving, are you meaning like 11 o'clock at night, or do you meaning 3 a.m.? Or when you work at night, you're going to pretty much need to do the whole night to try to get it done?
Yeah, the latter.
Yes, Jack.
I understand the issue about schools with 14th and Hawthorne, but why electric for night paving?
Yeah, electric, and Freeman can speak to this more than I can. I think it's a traffic management thing. Again, we haven't made the final decision yet on electric, but electric is going to be, we're going over concrete there, and maybe I'll turn it over to Freeman, but it's a little bit more in-depth process than we typically do with a general paving, because we're going to have to put some fabric down in pre-level. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, electric was specifically traffic management just because it is a pretty busy corridor, and the detouring that can be a chore. So the schools was to minimize disruption really from the school's standpoint, but and just electric being a busy corridor, we want to have that option. It's more likely that we'd use it for the school areas and less likely for electric because we can probably do that one lane at a time, but to have that option because of the traffic counts you see on that. The other 4th Street is Kellogg, and that's, we can work that, so we didn't feel the need to put that in as an option.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we have a motion before us. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we will recommend to the full council this afternoon, or this evening. Next item up, our last item is the bicycle master plan.
Yes, thank you. This is a follow-up to the evening presentation that council received back in August on the draft bicycle master plan. So there was a fairly lengthy presentation at that time. We committed to come back to a work session to discuss it in more detail, answer any questions that council may have. We don't actually have a presentation tonight. As we suggested back in August, we would simply open this up for a work session. The staff is here to answer any questions, and prior to the meeting today, Jack handed out a list of questions. So it's at the council's pleasure. We can go through these questions we received one by one. I don't know if there's any questions that Terry, you or Michael have, but we can certainly answer those as well. So if that works for you, we can I can turn it over to Kim and staff, and we'll just start going through the process questions, or the questions that Jack handed out.
Yeah, it's a good process. Okay. I've had my questions answered. This is a great report.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll take the first one here. It's just a general question. What's the process for approving this actual document? Council will approve this. We'll ask for council to approve it. And then, as we did with the pedestrian master plan, so we'll take a vote of the council, have approved document, and then we will roll this into the comprehensive plan, just as we will the pedestrian plan, into the transportation element when council approves that. I think Greg's plan is to have that done next year, and we have to have it done in 2016. Does this take a resolution? Are we going to do a resolution? Do you know?
Yes.
So we'll have a resolution for council to approve it based on.
We're not actually adopting it tonight. We will be waiting for the resolution.
Yeah,
or
so
directing you to put forward a resolution, and then we'll do it at another meeting.
Exactly. So we'll get any changes that council wants to do today. That was our hope, and to be able to address those, we'll bring it back with a resolution to approve with those amendments. So then we're just going to go chapter by chapter here. The first one, or actually I'll take the second one, which is in chapter 1, and that's what's the process for updating the Public Works bicycle standards as called for in chapter 1 of this PED plan. So that's a good question. The city has both design guidelines and standards. We have been working on updating our design guidelines, and that's something that will continue in 2015. This document, this bicycle master plan, along with the pedestrian master plan, gives us some of the inputs into updating those design guidelines. We will be proposing some additional money in 2015 to help us update our design guidelines. We'll also have to come back and have some amendments to the Bellingham Municipal Code. So that's part of the standards that will have to come back. They're part of the land use code. So that'll have a formal process in front of council, which will take formal council approval. The design guidelines are administrative, so those are departmental approval. The standards come back to council for approval.
Got it.
Does that include lane widths? That was one of the policies, revised motor vehicle lane widths.
Yeah, so that's in the standards, so that would come back to council.
What direction would those revisions take? Revise them, doesn't tell me how they might be revised. I assume this is
This is the policy document that's
Right.
feeding that process. So we're going to take the recommendations out of the bicycle master plan and look at those and see how we need to amend those standards. So this is the first step in the process. So this is giving us policy guidelines that talk about where we should be looking at bicycle facilities, what type of facilities, and how that would impact the total cross-section of the right-of-way we're working with, along with the pedestrian plans that talk about the pedestrian environment. This is the first step. We need to develop those and bring them back to council.
Is it fair to say the general policy direction is to look at being able to, in some situations, narrow the travel lane to create more opportunities for pedestrian and bicycle facilities or buffers or whatever?
Yeah, that's fair.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Jack might have stumped me unless someone knows this here. How many miles of arterioles, do you know?
Kim Brown, Public Works. This is on.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, Kim Brown, Public Works. I don't have that number at the top of my head.
We have 300 miles of street. I know that. I don't know how many miles of arterioles, but we'll get that for you.
Yeah, the purpose of the question had to do with our interest of wanting to have complete streets on arterioles, and you know, what kind of penetration into that complete street policy do we want to accomplish through the bike master plan? If we're looking at, you know, almost 32 miles of you know, bike lanes, how does that compare to our overall potential percentage of arterioles? So
Okay.
it's not associated really with the plan, but it's
Right.
more of a, you know, kind of a tracking thing. It's almost maybe a metric type of thing that we could put into the legacy documents, but
Yeah, okay. Well, we can have further discussion about that. Chapter 3, moving into Chapter 3, because we talked on Chapter 2 was, we kind of addressed that in the first one in terms of development requirements, I think. Chapter 3, and this is a good question, as an example of how do we deal with traffic calming on arterioles, because we've talked about with council in the past that our neighborhood traffic safety program, which dealt with physical calming devices, we did not apply that to arterial streets. So in a case where we're recommending bicycle boulevards on arterioles, and Monroe is the example that's given here, how do we address that? Do you want to speak to that?
In general, we're not recommending traffic calming on arterial streets, bicycle, where we're recommending bike boulevards. There will be other treatments that we do, but but we will look at each of those projects on a case-by-case basis. When implementing a bike boulevard, there's other features such as wayfinding that will be part of that project, but we're not expecting to do traffic calming on any of the arterioles where we are recommending bike boulevards. But again, that will be on a case-by-case basis. If there are problems, then we'll look at how we can address that.
so can you give me an example what the other treatments that you would put onto an arterial?
We'd be doing wayfinding.
That's it?
That would be the primary, yeah. And
Because my idea, I guess the way I always thought of a bike boulevard was to have streets that you would purposely try to minimize the interactions with vehicles through either traffic calming or simply, you know, traffic diversion is even a better way of doing it. And I don't, yeah, I didn't see that really in the plan itself as far as traffic diversions.
That would be more common on a residential street, but the primary treatments are the wayfinding, traffic calming as needed, which could be diversion, and then the other thing is the crossing of arterioles. So we're looking at calmer streets, but the key parts are then getting people across arterial intersections.
And I think it's important to note that, you know, we've identified the bicycle boulevard network, and you see that that's the prevalent treatment in the plan, but they still need to be designed. So we still need to look at those routes and look at whether you're going through more of a residential area, what are the treatments that you put at intersections, whether it's traffic diverters or whatever the method might be to give the priority to that mode in that direction. Those still need to be worked on, and we're one of the first bicycle boulevards. You know, you'll see some in the plan. We talked about it in the tip in the Roosevelt area, getting everyone down to the undercrossing of I-5 at Kentucky. Those are being looked at now and designed. And so I think when Kim says it's on a case-by-case basis, it's still a project that needs to be designed, even though they're fairly low cost, and certainly low cost compared to other projects that we do, namely pedestrian projects where you're putting in so much infrastructure that they're very costly. We still need to look at what's the appropriate treatment. And most of the bicycle boulevards are going to be on low volume residential streets. You do have some arterioles like Monroe that are classified as arterioles. They're fairly low volume arterioles in the grand scheme of things, but most of these treatments are on residential streets. Most of your arterial treatments are going to be bike lane, buffered bike lane, cycle track, protected bike lane, something like that, rather than bike boulevards.
All right, I'm concerned about it, but
Concerned that there's not enough detail in the plan to.
that, but also it just seems like it's a formula for, you know, like for instance Monroe. If it is an arterial, it is collecting. It's a collector arterial, so it is collecting vehicles, and we're mixing it up with trying to designate this is where you really should ride a bicycle too. So to me, it seems like we're creating the conflict by saying Monroe is the best street for both vehicles and for bicycles, instead of trying to, you know, take a parallel route or something else. I'm just using that one as an example. There may be other ones too, but.
And that, there aren't really any parallel routes right through that section?
I think you may have found maybe one or two examples of that in the whole network. I mean, I think if you look at the network.
That's why I was looking for special treatment.
Yeah, I think if you look at the network, that what you're suggesting is exactly what's happening. There, we've identified parallel, low volume, parallel, low stress, low volume routes that are parallel to arterials or higher volume streets. I mean, that's certainly the goal and really exactly what the boulevards are all about. But if you don't have those parallel routes, and that's a challenge mostly in the northern part of the city where you don't have the connectivity and you have, you know, large blocks, if blocks at all, you have more undeveloped area that's going to be constrained by sensitive areas and wetlands. It's more challenging to do that. I think the Monroe example is a little bit unique in the built area where it's one of the few areas where we don't have great parallel routes right there. So, I mean, I think it's a good point, and certainly not our plan to mix folks and to create a conflict, but where there is no other option, you do something with signage, you do something with how you treat the intersections, the intersecting streets to provide that priority to the through traffic, and that's a better treatment than what we have now.
Yeah, I have to agree with that part, because riders are going to need to ride on certain areas anyway, and will be riding, and if we can do something with the boulevard to call attention to it, it improves. I think that improves safety. It's not going to be the most perfect solution that we have all the time, but yeah, it's better than just leaving it as it is. It does improve, it does make it safer. So.
And the wayfinding can include
Right.
both signage as well as markings in the pavement,
Right.
which helps alert motorists that this is a shared space for bicyclists and vehicles.
And that gets into my concern, because it's, the Sharrow concept is that nobody's, especially on a street like Monroe, you cannot pass a bicyclist because it's going to be a very dangerous act. And that means that whoever the slowest, it's the least common denominator argument, whoever's the slowest is going to be the one that's going to kind of rule the traffic flow. And if it's an 8-year-old kid using that as a bike boulevard, then all the cars behind it are going to have, that's the speed limit, is the 8-year-old kid. And I don't know, that's where I'm concerned about that.
What is the suggestion on Monroe? I'd welcome a suggestion.
To declassify Monroe as a collector arterial is one.
But making a declassification on paper doesn't change the volume of the street. I mean, that's something we need to think about. I mean, making changes on paper, it's just like posting an arbitrary speed limit. It doesn't change the condition.
To declassify it, then you can put other traffic calming. You can slow the cars down in other ways. Because there's this internal policy that we're not allowed to have traffic calming on collector arterials.
Yeah, well, right now we don't have traffic calming on anything. I mean, we don't.
Well,
it's an
I know.
unfunded program.
I know.
But I think the point is you to look at something one street segment, one street corridor at a time. I mean, that's the fundamental problem with traffic calming is that's a flawed concept. You have to look at the system as a whole, because by putting traffic calming in on an arterial, you don't change the volume of the network. You've simply directed it somewhere else, probably somewhere that's less capable of taking the volume, right? So you've taken it off an arterial onto a residential street, which is exactly what we don't want to do. And that's why when we put traffic calming in, we get as many complaints about it as we did people wanting it. And that's why it has to be looked at as a network, not on an individual complaint basis, but how are we making the network the safest it can be? It takes more time, and you got to think about it, and it's not as immediate of a response to somebody, but it's the right way to do it.
Okay.
All right, so Kim, do you want to just go down these?
Sure. The next is how are bicycle boulevards and bike lanes treated when new travel lane width standards are reconciled against these improvements? For example, downtown boulevards. One of the benefits of having flexibility in travel lane widths is that it allows for it can allow for implementation of bike lanes, buffered bike lanes, so those sort of treatments. In terms of downtown boulevards, I'm not sure what you're specifically referring to.
That has to do with from what reading the plan, it seems like the downtown is kind of off limits to any sort of real major bike improvements outside of the ones that have already been done. And like when Prospect Street was redone, to me it seemed like, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but to me it seemed like there was enough width to be able to install a bike lane in there and a travel lane and the parking, and so in essence to have a bicycle lane in there. Right now it's being proposed as a Sharrow, and safety-wise, I mean, for all of the reasons why, in the introductory chapters about the concerns and fears that bike riders or potential bike riders would have about wanting to bike, to be able to get them in the downtown, if they had the knowledge that they had a bike lane that they could get to from point A to point B, would be better than to say, well, you just got to go out there into the traffic and hope that they're going to drive as slow as you bike. That's my concern.
We did look at Prospect being able to put a bike lane in, but it would have entailed removing parking on at least one side of the road. And that's something that, with the downtown planning, removal of parking is very discouraged in the downtown area. So it comes down to weighing that, and I do know with Prospect, we looked to see if we could get bike lanes in when we were doing the DuPont Elm Northwest corridor, but there wasn't the width in it.
It must have been by inches.
Pardon me?
It must have been by inches.
Yeah. So with most of the downtown streets, keeping parking, we can't put in a facility like a bike lane. But the idea is marking those routes where we're unable to get a bike facility, keeping speeds low, so that it is a safer experience for bicyclists. And then the next question is, why are bike accidents from 2006 to 2010 listed in Appendix G instead of up-to-date information? The city's software system for recording bicycle collisions has been down. There's been problems with that software, and actually that software has been used by a number of jurisdictions, and it's just been troubleshooting for that. We are going to go to a new system and get staffing to do that, so we just haven't updated that at this point.
The data's in the system, but we just can't retrieve it?
The data, no, it will need to be back entered. I mean,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Should the tiered priority projects and their scoring listed in this plan be reviewed by the neighborhoods as a reality check? A couple things on that. We did get a lot of public input, recommendations on the plan, and from neighborhoods across the city. With a bike network, you're looking at connectivity across the city. You really can't look at it just neighborhood by neighborhood, so I see this being problematic with, generally if you go to a neighborhood, they're looking just at the boundaries of their neighborhood, and it doesn't really work with a citywide network.
Yeah, and I appreciate that.
Okay.
I was just looking at I brought up the one example in the pedestrian master plan where having at least a neighborhood reality check would have probably helped a few different projects,
Okay.
At least in my neighborhood, but I could also see it happening elsewhere. And the same thing is just any new information. And it gets into another comment that I had made later on, which was, people made comments in the open houses and also in the plan. There was a comment tracker that was done, but it didn't seem like there was any sort of real staff response to those particular comments that the person that made the comment understood that their comment was taken and either addressed or dismissed or modified in one form or another.
And we can add that into the appendix if needed. We have staff responses. A number of the comments that came in at the open houses and through the survey and the map, online mapping exercise, all of those were used when we did the development of the network and advised the plan, and the steering committee reviewed all those comments. So they were incorporated in the plan, but I see your point about wanting to see staff responses. Are you recommending that we include that in the appendix?
I don't know, because at this time, the plan is the plan, and whether or not that's going to help the plan or not, I guess that's a council call, but it would have been nice. I don't know if I want to go and ask you to go and do that as one person, but
Well, we have all the responses, so it's not a work effort to do it.
well, I guess, was that a department decision not to put in I'm looking at this maybe a more macro type thing, because when we've dealt with some other departments, they seem to, there has been this internal policy to always include staff comment to any comments, public comments.
I don't think it was an intentional policy. Public Works works on all those other plans as well, and most of the comments come from us anyway, so we can...
So you've done this in the past?
Yeah, we do it on all of them, so we can certainly do it. It was not in something we did intentionally. We have those responses, and we can put them in the document. It's easy to do, so.
Yeah, at this time, I guess I would rather you implement the plan than to backtrack in this.
Okay. A number of the comments that are in the appendix were, ones that just people were pointing out areas that they wanted to see addressed, or barriers or whatnot. So again, I mean, a response might have been, yes, we will address that in the plan. They seemed like basically the response needed was to address that in the network that we developed. But I think this is something, I understand your point with this.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
How extensive were traffic calming devices designed into the cost estimates of the various projects? What went into the cost calculator provided in Appendix D as it pertains to traffic calming techniques? In terms of traffic calming per se, the cost estimates are really planning level cost estimates. And when it gets into traffic calming on an individual, say, Bike Boulevard project, that is down to a much more detailed design level. What we did with the Bike Boulevards is look at the 3 different levels of crossing improvements, arterial crossing improvements, and that cost differentiated the projects pretty substantially. But in terms of any other traffic calming treatments, we didn't incorporate that because it would require a further level of design detail.
What types of traffic calming would you not want to go and consider on a residential street?
For a bike boulevard?
Yeah.
I think you would, I mean, the treatments that would be, oh, okay.
So, Eric Johnston, Public Works Department. So traffic calming devices are unique to the situation where they would apply. And at this level, we would not exclude options from traffic calming from that pool of potential candidates you could choose to do traffic calming on there. But with the bike plan, it's not necessarily intended to do traffic calming. If as we go through and implement the bicycle plan and identify that traffic calming is necessary to support the bicycle improvements or encouraging bicyclists to be out there, then there may be traffic calming improvements to be associated with that. But the bicycle plan is not intended to be a traffic calming instrument, if you will. But on the same token, we haven't taken any of those traffic calming elements off of the table. But there's nothing specific in there, and those cost estimates are not based on a specific set of improvements. As Kim says, they are planning level estimates, and there's going to be some fluctuation up or down with those costs.
Yeah, as I see bike boulevards installed in other cities, it just seems like they take great strides to make sure that it's local access only for the cars, but to try and make it as convenient as possible to get bikes from one side to the other. And I'm just, this gets into another internal policy or council policy thing of how are we going to look at these bike boulevards on residential streets? What is going to be that end goal? Are we going to do that, or are we going to do something different than that? We can really try and minimize vehicle traffic. Like for instance, Texas. We take Texas right now. Is that going to be set up so that it's going to be local access only, or are you going to be able to go down a number of blocks to be able to get to one of the other arterioles? On Texas.
On Texas, I can see more traffic circles being utilized, which has a traffic calming effect, but also allows access to, there will be other bike boulevards feeding off of Texas. So we'll be looking at that pretty carefully. I mean, what you want is through movement for bicycles all along the corridor. And then the traffic circles where appropriate, and then you monitor for that. Looking at other jurisdictions, they will follow, what happens once you implement the bike boulevard, and then are other treatments needed? Are you seeing a lot more vehicle traffic on that, or higher speeds? Then you might go to a different level. Do we need a diverter? That sort of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a little bit more on Texas Street and the traffic circles? The traffic circles are the small, say, 10-foot in diameter
Yes.
things. they seem to work really well in the sense that cars barely need to slow down, but there's no way on earth you can speed through them. I mean, and for a bicyclist, they're invisible. This seems to me, my overall concern is I understand the need, but I don't like bike lanes along arterioles. I really don't like breathing tailpipe fumes. I think it's really unhealthy, and I think that 60% of people who, might want to do bicycling also doesn't like arterioles. And so places like Texas Street, I think, is where some of our largest gain will come.
I agree with you.
And so I'm looking for more Texas-like opportunities, which is why Jack's questions about traffic calming, I think, are very, very appropriate. Something like a traffic circle is traffic calming, but it so changes the character of the street that I think does what's usually nearly impossible, which is to make bicycles and cars sharing the same lane both feel comfortable, neither one feel like they're, a second-class citizen. Cars don't feel blocked off and bicyclists don't feel threatened. I don't know. I'm looking for the right mix in the overall plan, and personally, I don't think the mix is good. I understand why we went heavy on bike boulevards. I think the greatest gain is going to be the in-betweeny things and then the more expensive things like cycle tracks or these traffic circles where you're going to create something like a highway for bicycles that is not doesn't clash with cars.
And I think that's the very intent of the bicycle boulevards. So I'm not seeing the distinction between what you're asking for.
Bicycle boulevards are on residential streets, and I assume Texas is a collector arterial, not a.
No,
okay.
it's a residential.
Okay, well, so I think that's it. When I think of, I cut through neighborhoods, like just right through the lettered streets, right? You can pick any street you want to go through a lot of lettered streets because they're all safe, calm streets.
So you're doing exactly what the plan is going to formalize through
Right.
wayfinding and, when necessary, traffic calming. We're not saying, the plan is not saying that traffic calming or physical devices that will give the priority to bicycles isn't appropriate. But what we do is we identify the network. We talk about what the treatment is, so a bicycle boulevard, you're going to have some wayfinding. You're going to, by the very nature of it, give the preference to the bicycling community. That may need to go along with the things that Jack's suggesting, physical diverters, other traffic calming that would make it less attractive or not possible for vehicles to go that same way, at least that same way for an extended period of time. So you're not getting the cut-through scenario that Jack's talking about. The bicycles have priority. They feel comfortable going through. They can go through, but vehicles aren't going to necessarily be able to do the same thing. But we need to remember, this is a policy document. This is a planning document. So each and every one of those bicycle boulevards needs to be designed. We need to go out and look at it and see, is this one of those scenarios where the traffic volumes are to the extent that we need to do some of those physical measures to make this a safe facility? Or are the volumes so low that really what we need to worry about is when we get to the arterioles and we need to cross the arterioles and what the treatment's going to be there. So they are case by case. The network looked at how do we get someone from here to there in the safest way? How do we provide that connectivity? The next level down is we have a project. It's this bicycle boulevard. The engineers need to go out, given the guidance from this manual and everything else in terms of how we design these facilities, look at all of the characteristics of that route and design it to give the priority to cyclists, because that's what this is all about. I mean, we wouldn't put a bicycle boulevard in without doing the appropriate treatments to make it feel safe for people. So I think we're talking the same thing. I think it's a level of detail that maybe you guys aren't seeing in here that you would like to see, so you feel more comfortable that it's going to give the priority to cyclists. And I think our response is we believe the policy direction would be there to design it to give that comfort level to the cyclists.
Well, I want to get back, of course, to Jack's questions, but I guess my comment is I'm seeing that bicycle boulevards is actually a pretty broad spectrum, and I'm seeing almost two subcategories in there. The Texas-type bike boulevard, which is, I don't know, the higher end, and then some other kind of surface streets like through lettered where they're kind of lower traffic volume bike boulevards. It seems like we're doing an awful lot within the spread of bike boulevard. Maybe that goes to your comment about the individualization. Not all bike boulevards look similar. Some might feel quite different from each other, but still technically be bike boulevards.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think, I think what you're liking about Texas is it's just a direct parallel route to Alabama. It's just feeling like it's already set up. Some of the other ones, it's maybe you have to get people there. It's a wayfinding situation where it might not be a route that people would normally take. But I think the concept of bike boulevard is simply, it's not on an arterial generally. I mean, you have the Monroe and a couple of exceptions to that. But generally, you're talking about low volume, low stress residential streets. Taking advantage of that, you as someone that's out riding now, you're already doing that. You're already cutting through the neighborhoods in a way that you feel comfortable going on the low volume residential streets, like through the lettered streets. We want to formalize that into a network so that everybody feels comfortable getting from where they need to be to where they want to go, or from where they are to where they want to go. Wayfinding, all these treatments are crucial to that. I will say, and we've talked about this before, on arterial treatments like bike lanes, whether it's the standard bike lane or a buffered bike lane, are also an important part of the network. They're not for everybody, but a lot of the destinations are on arterials. So at some point, you need to have that facility to get people where they need to go. And for other people, they just want the most direct route. And if arterials are the most direct and they're with a bike lane, even though it's not for everyone, it's the way that they like to go. And so we want to have a good mix. And we put the priority on bike boulevards because you're right, that segment of the population that we want to get riding, they're going to be more comfortable in those low volume, low stress scenarios.
Okay, next. The plan appears to have no mention of bicycle lockers and only one small mention for covered bicycle racks. Are these improvements being de-emphasized? No, they're not being de-emphasized. But again, with a bicycle parking program, we need to look, we actually are going to develop a plan looking at the downtown area and downtown in Fairhaven to prioritize where we're installing racks, take a look at where a covered facility would be the most appropriate. Right now, we're working with WTA to put in a covered facility at the downtown station. In terms of lockers, we've had that discussion. They are more interested in doing a bike cage. And
this is WTA?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the bike locker, there's issues with bike lockers in terms of crime and whatnot and access and how many people they would serve. So we are looking at that, but particularly for the facility, WTA, we're working with WTA on, they're looking at more of a key card bike cage system.
Okay. So with this bicycle parking plan that you're talking about, if it's only going to be commercial or the downtown and Fairhaven area, it would seem like that would be a nice thing to have in a development code within the planning department to have as an overall requirement for any commercial setup, and it would seem like the bike plan that could inform what the development code changes, modifications would be.
And there are requirements right now for bicycle parking in the development code, but that's something that could be updated. I would assume I'm going to refer to Chris in the comp plan.
Fairhaven Waterfront and Downtown Urban Village plans actually do have parking requirements for new and redevelopment. Covered parking is very different, and you can't require one particular development to put out a community-oriented covered bike parking facility. You have to have some kind of nexus in terms of the impact of that development and the need to provide that facility. So what it seems like Ken was talking about is a community need for bicycle parking in a particular area. That's something that we can continue to work on. We can develop additional policy for this comprehensive plan and have a community effort to go out and look at what the demand and needs are. And then somehow try to figure out a way to get Nolan to contribute to that rather than requiring them to put it in.
So Sorry, Jack, but just since that wasn't on the microphone, the staff just commented on the newly adopted urban village plans and neighborhood plans that do have some improved requirements for bicycle facilities. But I think what you're saying, Jack, and I think it's a good point, is that community-wide facilities that we may not be able to require individual developers to build, but the city still needs to, it's a need and we need to address it, should be looked at, and it might be something we need to spend some more time looking at. And Kim mentioned what is currently being discussed at the WTA facility downtown. We've also had discussions about could we do something at the parkade, when we update the parkade, provide better covered parking for bicycles at the parkade. And we have some there, but could we do something better? And then maybe in some of the other core areas like Fairhaven. So that may be something that we need to spend a little bit more time on, but I think your point is a good one. It's not something that we're trying to de-emphasize, but rather maybe we just need to spend a little bit more time identifying what those needs are.
Yeah, so actually there's two different types of covered parking. There's going to be covered parking for the community, and you spoke to that. And then Chris, you were mentioning that a private developer wouldn't want to, we couldn't make them provide covered parking for the community, but we could for their employees.
Right.
And it gets into a situation of who's the employees versus who's the customers to those businesses or to the general public as a whole.
And I think I'd have to go back and look at it, but I know it started with the update of the Fairhaven plan, where we were putting in much more stringent requirements for bicycle parking, and I think some of that was pulled out of what Portland had done, and there were some pretty large parking requirements for bicycles. I'll have to go back and look at it, but we had very similar for downtown and for the waterfront. For redevelopment or development downtown, that would address, I think, what you're talking about, employees or customers of that business. And it's probably this larger need that may not be incorporated in that.
Go ahead.
Could we turn to page 25 of the draft, policy 6.2, which is, and it has 3 actions. That has to do with bicycle parking. So most broadly, how is staff going to interpret that policy direction there on bicycle parking? And maybe more specifically, what exactly is the Association of Pedestrian Bicycle Professionals Bicycle Parking Guide look like? You say you're going to use it as a model. What is it actually calling for? Is it calling for what we might have already been calling for in Fairhaven? Is it calling for more of that, or something new and different that I don't know about? I don't know what that's calling for.
The guide that you reference, it's looks at both short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and makes recommendations for, they actually have recommendations for development requirements for residential, for business, and they cite examples from different jurisdictions, but they also give very specific guidelines in terms of implementing short-term, medium-term, and long-term, the type of bike racks you would use.
When you say short-term, medium-term, you're talking about how long the person parks there?
Yeah,
okay.
Like the inverted U, if I'm just going to a store, I'm going to be there a couple hours versus I need covered parking, or I really need a place where I can lock my bike. I mean,
keep it.
It's going to be there all day or overnight or something.
I've noticed time for our committee is coming to an end. We're about halfway through the questions. I'm wondering, would staff be available for tonight for us to finish going through questions? And
is there any deadline in
I
terms
know,
of
Michael,
wanting
you
to?
have some more too, but that's what I'm saying. So if we can do, it looks like it should be a short evening tonight, so we should be able, we would be able to do some of it.
We can certainly do that. We could also schedule, there's no, I think Jack was asking if there's a timeline on this. There really isn't. We obviously want to move forward. We could schedule, not knowing what your next meeting looks like.
Yeah.
We could schedule another work session.
Okay, I'm just curious, because I know I can't work through till noon today. I've got some appointments.
Do you want to just push it till another work session instead of dealing with tonight? Because, I mean, the issue is that this is a committee. If the other council members don't want to be part of this committee meeting this morning, they may not want to go and participate tonight either.
Yeah, I was just trying to, because I don't know what's coming up in
Yeah.
terms of our schedule and things, so.
I think, and Brian may have a better feel for the next meeting, but I think from the Public Works perspective, that would be fine to schedule for your next work session, and that way, it might be a little easier to have all of the appropriate staff here.
Okay.
And we can spend some time going through the remainder of these questions and be prepared to answer. And Michael, if you have anything, and could
Perhaps
get it.
if you could put them in writing, and
Yeah.
then staff provide some writing, we
Yeah,
could
we
move
can,
through it quicker. It would
Yeah.
be easier.
I think that would work for us.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Do that.
so we will bring this to adjournment at this time, and then we will schedule another work session.
Thank you.
We are now adjourned.